Chris Bowen, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Tony.
Now, what does the following phrase mean? That is a stain on our national character.
Well, I know where you're going with that question, Tony. Clearly you're referring to the Labor Party's opposition in 2006 to legislation to say that boat arrivals that arrive on the mainland should be treated the same as boat arrivals that arrive on an offshore place. The Labor Party had that position in 2006 and I had that position in 2006. But I've changed my mind.
What does that phrase mean? That is a stain on our national character.
Well,
when you said it at the time, was it just political rhetoric or did you actually mean it?
No, Tony, at the time, I supported Labor Party policy. As an opposition backbencher, I supported the policy. Now I'm a cabinet minister in a government, and I've reflected on the change in circumstances, on the recommendation to this government from the expert panel of Angus Houston, Paris Aristotle and Michael Lestrange. And let's be clear about this, Tony. This is a recommendation that the panel made to the government, and they were very explicit in their recommendation and said this is necessary to save lives, because you can't have the situation that people would arrive at, say, Christmas Island or Ashmore Reef and then be taken to Nauru and Papua New Guinea. But if they stay on the boat for 3 days longer and risk their lives for 3 days longer, then that wouldn't apply to them. That would provide a perverse incentive. The panel made it clear that this was necessary to save lives.
Are you prepared now to say that John Howard was right all along?
Well, what I'm prepared to say, Tony, on this particular issue is that I've changed my mind, and as the Minister for Immigration, I've argued to the Cabinet,
No, but that's
caucus.
a very specific question about John Howard's policy, which you described as a stain on our national character. Are you now saying that he was right all along?
If you let me, Tony, I'll answer your question. I'm saying very clearly I've changed my mind, and as Minister for Immigration, I argued to the Cabinet, the caucus and the National Conference on all these issues that the Labor Party needed to change its position.
It's going to press you to actually answer me on the John Howard question. Was he right all along when you accused him of placing a stain on our national character?
Well, Tony, I'm making the point. 2 points here. One, we are doing this as part of an integrated package. When John Howard attempted this in 2006 and people in his own party rebelled against it, as well as the then Labor Party opposition, it was a one-off. It was just a one-off measure which wasn't properly worked into an integrated system. We're doing it, as well as increasing the humanitarian intake to 20,000 people, the biggest increase in refugees to come to this country in 30 years, as well as doing the other things like the changes to the family reunion system, etc. So this isn't one-off.
Breathtaking hypocrisy. That's the charge from Scott Morrison. Are you prepared to wear that charge in order to get your side of politics onto the populist side of the asylum seeker debate?
Not for 1 second will I accept that sort of charge from Scott Morrison, of all people. Yes, the Labor Party's changed its position. Political parties change their mind when faced with different circumstances. Not every party has the same position in 2012 as they had in 2006. The Liberal Party in 2006
usually on matters of great principle, which that must apply to something that's a stain on a national character. They usually do keep their principles intact.
In 2006, the Liberal Party supported putting a price on carbon, for example. If political parties didn't change their position from time to time, we'd all have the same political policies we had in 1901. But I'll say this, yes, I've changed, and the Labor Party has changed its position to save lives. I would hope Scott Morrison would do the same thing and say, well, we'll change our opposition to the Malaysia Agreement, for example, because it's necessary to save lives. I think the Australian people, let's not forget, Tony, it was only a short time ago, just a couple of months ago, that this whole building and this whole nation were dealing with the reverberations of two tragedies at sea within a fortnight. That we were saying the government should do something, the parliament should do something to solve this impasse. Both sides should compromise, both sides should walk away from their previous positions and find a common ground. We did that. We engaged the expert panel. That means taking difficult decisions. It means changing your position. It means copying the criticism of some who say you shouldn't change your position.
Well, it also means, if I may say this, it also means dragging the Labor caucus actually to the right of Tony Abbott on the asylum seeker issue, probably for the first time in living memory. Do you accept that?
Well, Tony, I would rather be here justifying this change in position than justifying why the government had rejected an expert panel recommendation about how to save lives. And if there was a tragedy, as somebody tried to get to Australia because they thought, oh, we'll go for the mainland to try and get around this law, then you would hold, rightly, the government to account if we hadn't accepted that recommendation.
As Scott Morrison said yesterday, there are coalition members who have held consistent views on this issue and that he would respect any decision they took to act consistently with their long-held principles. Sounds like he wants a conscience vote on this. Would Labor agree to have a conscience vote for your members?
No, it sounds like to me that he's accepting the fact that he couldn't control some of his votes and he's simply just giving up on them and saying, well, I can't control a couple of my caucus members. Now, in our case, there was a caucus discussion about this. The caucus very, very clearly backed my recommendation that based on the expert panel's recommendation, we should change this law, and that's how the caucus will be voting.
And you expect, obviously, you're going to get the vast majority of coalition votes, is that right?
Well, certainly, given the coalition's rhetoric on this and their track record, I'd be astounded if they then found some way of opposing this legislation against the very clear recommendation that this is necessary to minimise the risk of life at sea.
Well, here's one possible argument they might make. What would happen if all countries who signed the UN Refugee Convention legislated to excise their home territory from their migration zones to exclude asylum seekers? What would happen if everyone did that?
Well, the Refugee Convention is an often quoted and little read document, Tony. And
I've got it actually in front of me. I can quote it to you.
Well, I'm glad you can, but a lot of people take the name of the Refugee Convention without actually acknowledging what it says. And the Refugee Convention says that you shan't return people to countries in which they will face danger and that you shall enable them access to processing. And Australia's actions here are entirely in accord with our signatory to the Refugee Convention. That is our very strong legal advice.
In actual fact, in 2006, you said that doing this would actually put the Refugee Convention at grave risk. I mean, you said that yourself back then. That's another thing you said that you seem to have completely overturned.
Tony, we can all go back and we can look at what I said in 2006. We can look at what Tony Abbott may have said about climate change in 2006. We can all do that.
Yes, but these are matters of principle based on laws and declarations to which Australia is a signatory. You had an opinion then. Now your principle on how that should be read has completely changed.
Well, the principle for me as Immigration Minister, as the person who's been dealing with these issues now for almost 2 years, or just on 2 years, is that we need to stop people dying on their way to get to Australia.
The overarching document on which the Refugee Convention is sort of based is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Australia is a signatory. Have you looked at that recently?
Yes.
So Article 14 says very simply, everyone has the right to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Does Australia still agree with that principle or not?
Well, Australia is not returning people to a country they are fleeing from. What we are doing, and remembering...
It says the right to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution.
Yeah, asylum means not being returned to the country you are fleeing if you have made a genuine case, an established case for protection. And our obligations under the Refugee Convention, which we are signatories for, says that we will not return people to countries they are fleeing persecution from. Now, and that we will enable access to processing. That is what we are doing. We are also, as many international organisations have recognised, countries are enabled to put in place laws to manage their borders and to ensure that there is a deterrence to risking life at sea. We are doing that. I understand, Tony, that people of goodwill and good faith will come to different conclusions on this from the government and from me. I understand that. These are vexed issues. But if we continue along the way we have, with all the experience we've seen of this up until now, and the experience we've seen of the increased arrivals and the tragedies, people who say the current system is working must, as a result, accept the implication that more people will die as a result of that policy decision. Now, if people come to that conclusion, I fully respect it. I'm not prepared to come to that conclusion.
All right,
I'm not prepared, as the Immigration Minister of Australia, to take the easy decision and say, well, because we said this in 2006, we're not allowed to change our position. We're just going to let people die on the way to Australia. I'm not prepared to justify that to you.
Well, here's something you said very recently. You've set in place the no advantage test, meant to have a sort of deterrent effect, but you haven't said how long people will be staying offshore, how long they'll be kept offshore before they can actually apply to come to Australia, even if they are found to be refugees.
Well,
how long is it? We're going to find out a year? Is it 4 years? Is it 5 years, as the opposition is saying it must be?
Well, the opposition have said a minimum of 5 years, but then the Leader of the Opposition said he couldn't put an exact figure on it in terms of individuals, which, you know, the opposition and the government, I think, I'm glad the opposition has now endorsed the no advantage principle. It was an important recommendation of the panel, and to oppose the no advantage principle is to say that you think people arrive in Australia by boat should get an advantage over some of those people I was talking about before in refugee camps around the world. We are talking years. It will vary from case to case in relation to people's particular vulnerabilities.
Could it be 5 years?
We are talking.
Could it be 5 years?
Yeah, we are talking about a long period of time.
5 years? Is that?
Yeah, we are talking.
You're saying a long period of time.
About years.
Are you saying 5 years?
Well, I'm not the one who said there's a minimum 5-year period in place. That's what Mr Morrison has said.
But you're saying it could be as long as that, as far as you're concerned. Well, it could be as long as 5 years.
I've been to Nauru, for example, Tony. I've spoken to the people in the centre at Nauru, and I've explained the no advantage principle to them, to their face, and told them that it's a period of years.
But how many years? I mean, there must be a maximum sentence, if you like, attached to this form of incarceration.
Well, of course. There's people around the world who've been waiting a very, very long time for a place in a country like Australia. So these are difficult circumstances for many millions of people.
But is there, in prospect, a maximum period that people will spend in these offshore processing camps? Is there a maximum?
Well, Tony, what we're doing is we're being very clear in our messaging to people thinking about coming to Australia.
Well, that's not very clear unless we know what the maximum is. It's clear if you say what the maximum is, it's not if you don't.
Just let me finish the sentence, Tony. Now, we are making that message very clear. Yes, we're working with our posts and with international organisations in the region and assessing how different people would be dealt with under the no advantage principle. We're talking about a long period of time, and yes, we'll continue to do that work with our posts in assessing how different people would be treated under the no advantage test. But it's an important principle, one that the government's committed to. And one of the things we're seeing here is people smugglers are spinning this to say, look, you'll only be on Nauru for a short period of time, then you'll end up in Australia, just like you did under the Howard government. You know, this is no change. We have a job to do here in communicating this. We have communicated it. We need to beef up our communication.
Just to be clear on this, I'm just going to ask you one more time. Is there a maximum period? Is there a maximum period of years that you could spend in an offshore detention centre?
Well, we haven't set a maximum, Tony. What we've done is said the no advantage principle will be applied on a case-by-case basis.
So you could be kept indefinitely? Is that what you're saying?
No, well, no, we're not talking about indefinitely. We're talking about people being processed in accordance with how they would be processed if they were in a centre waiting for resettlement to Australia in our region.
But you see why that's not clear? It's somewhere between indefinitely and a number of years.
Well, if you want me to lay you out a schedule and say, well, this person will wait X years and this person will wait Y years, I'm not doing that on your show tonight, Tony. I've indicated to you that we're talking with our posts and developing the criteria for the establishment of the no advantage principle. You're asking me to provide you with a schedule. I'm not doing that on your show tonight. I do understand your point about the numbers of years, but I've said that we're talking about long periods of time. We are talking about a message which is difficult for some people, but it's a principle which is, in my view, sound, that if you are waiting in a camp, whether it be in Kuala Lumpur or in Jakarta or in some other place, Quetta or around the world, and you've applied for resettlement to Australia, those people should have a equitable chance of resettlement in Australia on the same basis, the same waiting time as those people who can afford to come to Australia by boat.
Principle, if your offshore diplomats came to the conclusion that the average waiting time of an Afghan in Quetta was 8 years, then you'd apply that in Nauru, would you?
Well, no, we'd look at the circumstances in our region, Tony. In our region is what the recommendation is, and that's what we're implementing.
All right, we'll have to leave you there. We thank you very much for taking the time to come in and talk to us tonight.
Thanks, Tony.